Good morning. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. On behalf of Jane Harmon, our President and CEO here at the Wilson Center, it's my honor to welcome you to the latest installment in the Wilson Center's Regional and Global Energy Series. This one is on the topic of Middle East energy beyond the Iran nuclear deal. I'm Andrew Seeley. I'm Executive Vice President. This is a series that we have been doing throughout the year. Some of you are interested particularly in the Middle East. This is the first time you're here. Some of you have probably been participants along the way in some of the other sessions that we've done on Africa and Latin America, on East Asia, North America, Russia and Eurasia, as well as a global look on energy futures. And in September, we're going to be having another global look at where energy security is going around the world. But today, we're very fortunate to be able to focus on the Middle East, which is obviously a key area. Not only are we in the middle, as you will hear, of discussions on the Iran nuclear deal, but it is obviously one of the most critical areas in terms of any discussion on energy. We are very fortunate to have a distinguished panel here. You'll have them introduced in a moment and moderated by Jan Kalitsky, who has been the lead on the energy series and a public policy fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Jan and David Goldwyn have also co-edited this fabulous and short book called Energy and Security, Strategies for a World in Transition. I actually highly recommend it to you. It is, it is as close as you can get to the Bible on energy issues. I mean, it really covers the world. This is the second edition. It is a fabulous book, whatever region you're interested in and whatever facet of energy security you're interested in. It has been the basis of the series that we've been doing as well. I'm particularly delighted today to introduce Henri Barkey. Dr. Henri Barkey is the new director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're immensely pleased to have him with us. He has joined us most recently from Lehigh University, where he's been a professor, but he is a prolific author. He has worked in policy circles in Washington quite a bit at state and other areas in the past, and is a very distinguished scholar on Middle East issues. And so, Henri, it is a great pleasure for all of us to have you here running our Middle East program, and I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. I wanted to welcome you to this event. This is, after all, the only event that I know this week that has not been canceled on Iran. So in that sense, I'm pleased to welcome you. As you know, irrespective of whether or not we get a deal on Iran, Iranian oil and whether its current production or its prospective production is very much the concern of many, whether you sit in Baghdad or Riyadh or in OPEC headquarters or any of the oil companies. So I look forward to the discussion today. I'm not going to take too much of your time, but welcome, and I'm glad that we have a meeting on Iran here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Henri, and I'm Jan Kalitsky. Thank you, Henri and Andrew, for your very nice introductory remarks. I just owe Andrew now a very big lunch for the statement that he made about the Bible, and the energy area, and holding up the book the way he did. Thank you very much, Andrew, for that. In fact, the book addresses both regional and global prospects for increasing international energy security. Great pleasure to work with David Goldwyn on this book and with our various authors. You'll see in the book 2 chapters specifically addressing Middle East energy issues, including Iran, Iraq, the Gulf, North Africa. So a little bit more advertising to get you interested in that. In addition, we have in the book chapters on what we call the Global Energy Security System, otherwise the acronym GESS. You will see in there a treatment of the global as well as the regional issues. Also, you will see copies of a new Wilson brief, which addresses the global system outside the auditorium. Feel free to help yourselves afterwards. And the book is available at a significant discount for those who are here at this meeting. So you will see order forms if you're interested in getting a hold of it. So Iran is again in the headlines, and as Henri said, we are waiting to see what the outcome will be of the Iran nuclear talks. The immediate issues of those obviously are nuclear related, but they have broader energy implications for Iran and the region, and this is what we are talking to. We're talking about the broader and the longer term, although very mindful, obviously, of whether there's a deal or not a deal. And in particular, as we well know, Tehran is pushing for an end to sanctions. Tehran is hoping for new investment in its oil and gas sector. Obviously, with the end of sanctions and the availability of additional funds, which we'll hear about from our panelists, that creates a new opportunity, the Iranians hope, for their oil and gas sector. If there is a deal which does phase out or end sanctions, we still have to ask ourselves how long it will take to for Iran to reverse its oil and gas production decline and to reestablish production growth. Then we need to ask ourselves what would be the response of Iran's neighbors, who are not necessarily enthusiastic about a major new player coming into the global energy market. And we're thinking here, of course, especially about Saudi, but about Gulf countries, and we're thinking about future prospects for Iraq and Kurdish moves to produce and export separately from Baghdad. All of that is part of the mix. And then there are the broader issues of the relationships among these energy trends and the geopolitics of the Middle East and the global energy markets. So there's many different strands to this fascinating jigsaw puzzle that we're looking at. And to help us untangle these many strands, we have an outstanding panel of experts. David Gordon, Senior Advisor to the Eurasia Group and former State Department Policy Planning Director and Vice Chairman of the National Intelligence Council, will speak to the broader trends and what one might call the disruption potential in the region, which is clearly not insignificant, right? And then Julia Nene, Principal at Energy Ventures LLC and former Managing Director at PFC and then at IHS Energy, will address the issues and trends in Iran. And then Jean-Francois Sesnek, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and Adjunct Professor at both Georgetown and the School of Advanced International Studies, will focus on the Arabian Gulf dimensions, Saudi Arabia in particular. And then, not least, my co-editor, David Goldwyn, who's president of Goldwyn Global Strategies and former State Department Special Envoy and International Energy Coordinator, will speak to the Iraq set of issues in their regional context. So it should be a good discussion, and without further ado, David Gordon will be first at bat. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Jan, and a great pleasure to be here, and particularly a great pleasure to be surrounded by so many of the finest experts on energy issues that we have. So my focus is really going to be on the geopolitics and some of the immediate implications for the energy markets, and then I think my colleagues are going to dig down deeper. I think a couple of starting points. The first is that that while the Iran negotiations are capturing a huge amount of attention now, stepping back and looking at the Middle East more broadly, this is really one of the most fluid and challenging times, certainly in my professional lifetime, in the region. And we've had basically in the aftermath of the Arab Spring in 2011, when there was a huge amount of optimism about the direction that the region would be headed in, things have really turned much more negative, both in terms of sectarian conflict, in terms of state breakup, in terms of an authoritarian counter-revolution in Egypt. And right now, there's not a floor in the region. I spend a lot of time looking at East Asia as well. In East Asia, you have a floor under the tensions there, driven largely by economic interdependence, strong governments in most of the key countries, and a substantial commitment by the U.S. military on a continued role. If you look at the Middle East, all of those are absent. So let me start by just a few comments on the salient things that I think are going to be in play as the energy situation moves forward. Let me start with the Islamic State, because I think the Islamic State and the rise of the Islamic State is certainly, along with the just much more assertive behavior from Russia, has been a major strategic surprise in the last year and a half since it swept into western Iraq. And now I think that's playing out in a way that is literally putting the state system in the Levant under enormous pressure. I frankly don't think that the pieces get put back together again. So you have in this critical area of geopolitics, you have the decline of the post-Ottoman settlement and real uncertainty about where this is going. I know that David's going to be talking more about that, but very, very important. I think that if you look at Islamic State in particular, I think they're suffering some setbacks, certainly in Syria. I think they're being challenged in Iraq, but in North Africa, they're actually expanding their influence. And the Islamic State factor is an additional one. It will be very interesting. Right now, both the U.S. and the Russians appear to be planning diplomatic offensives in the aftermath of a successful Iran nuclear negotiation to try to bring together regional actors in a way that challenges the Islamic State. Whether the U.S. and Russia will be able to work collaboratively on this, that was a very big question at this point. Proxy conflicts, in particular between the Shia powers, Iran and Hezbollah, and the Gulf states, Saudi, the Emirates, but also very importantly with Egypt as well, and Egypt playing an independent proxy role, particularly in Libya. But Libya and Yemen, focal point for proxy wars, threatened also, obviously, to deepen in Syria. One of the biggest uncertainties, to my mind, right now in the region is around the traditional alliance systems and the traditional allies for the major actors. And there's a lot of hedging behavior going on. And the most interesting recent hedging behavior is between traditional rivals, Saudi Arabia and Russia. The Saudis announced just this week a new investment package for Russia. The deputy crown prince was in Moscow recently, and sort of where is this going? Tremendous uncertainty all over the region, frankly, about the U.S. role. I think President Obama did a little bit better than I expected at the Gulf Summit a couple of months ago, but that was only because expectations were so low. And then I think one of the most significant issues having to do with fragmentation are the Kurdish gains in Syria along the Turkish border, and whether that will open up a further effort at potential militarization. I know there's been a lot of talk in the Turkish media about engagement by Turkish forces, possibly against IS as a way to prevent Kurdish consolidation, but possibly against Kurdish forces themselves. And then finally, we're nearing the end game of the Iranian negotiations. President Obama last night met with Senate Democrats and was reported to say that he thought the prospects for an agreement were now less than 50-50. I don't know. I mean, right now you have the two biggest issues looming here are the question of inspector access to sensitive sites and the 1159 Iranian demand that the UN arms embargo be lifted, which is something that the U.S. and other Western countries cannot and will not agree to. So let me very quickly talk about implications for energy markets. I think in terms of potential disruptions, the key country to look at over the next 6 months is going to be Libya. It was Libya coming back into the market that played a critical role in putting downward pressure on price last year. They're actually in the process now of building up their export volumes, but, and this is a huge but, that the political and security situation in Libya is extraordinarily fragile. I was in Rome a couple of weeks ago, and I met with a senior Italian defense official and said, why don't you Americans just tell Sisi that he has to stop supporting General Haftar? And, yeah, sure. Obama's going to call Sisi and say, stop supporting General Haftar, and Sisi's going to hang up the phone. But I think that's a huge uncertainty here. Iran itself is a big uncertainty. I think there's a really interesting question of what's the market impact of Iran coming in? How long is it going to take? What will there be how severe will be the competition between Iran and the Gulf states for market share? I mean, we're now in a world already of oversupply, at least in the short term. So that for Iran coming into the market and having success in the market is far from assured, even if it gets access to the market. So that question is looming, and I know we're going to pick that up. I think that one uncertainty, a big uncertainty here in the Middle East energy equation is the Saudi and the other Gulf states' response to lower energy prices, and might this new diplomatic dance with the Russians be part of a Saudi hedge to try to create the possibility later down the line for engaging in supply management? Again, the Saudis aren't going to do it without the Russians and the Iranians, but it's a very big ask. But it partially depends on how the Saudis read the longer-term trends in the energy market. And my final point here is that I think all of this uncertainty in the Middle East ends up being bearish for energy markets, for the pass-through through financial markets themselves. And it's that I think Middle East uncertainty, as has been the case very often historically, leads to a strengthening of the dollar, safe haven element of the U.S. A strong dollar will put downward pressure on the energy markets. But right now we have the Middle East sort of poised between the risk of both supply disruption on the one hand and failure of the talks, which would be bullish for markets, and the potential of exacerbation of the oversupply, and that's the essence of what our three speakers are going to be addressing in the rest of the panel. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, David. That's terrific. And over to Julia Nene now on the Iran side.
Well, thank you for coming. This is actually a very interesting topic, and we'll see how all of this evolves. For Iran, of course, the timing of the lifting of sanctions will be key, and even if a deal is reached, it would take 6 to 12 months. So the oil and gas sector developments, I think, are not imminent, but it could be in 2016. I think one of the key issues for Iran is trying to return to being the second largest producer in OPEC. Iraq has pushed up into this arena. I guess they're producing about 3.8 million barrels a day in the last few months, but I think Iran would like to get back to between 4 and 5 million barrels a day. And when we talk about Iranian production, sometimes, the numbers out there are for crude oil, but there's also crude oil and condensates. So when you look at the BP statistical review, for example, they generally factor in crude oil and condensate numbers. So they put Saudi production as high as 11.5 million barrels a day. But when we're talking oil, it's about 10.3, and I guess for Iran, for oil, it's about 2.8 right now. But the Iranians, I see them actually speaking about bringing back 700,000 to 800,000 barrels a day as quickly as possible. There is this issue of, according to oil traders, Iran may have as much as 40 to 45 million barrels sitting offshore in tankers. They have 42 supposedly very large crude oil tankers parked in 3 different areas of the Gulf. So some of this oil, maybe 20 million barrels, could be released pretty efficiently and quickly. That would be, I think, about 200,000 barrels a day, maybe over a period of 3 or 4 months. Sanctions have locked up quite a bit of money for Iran because sanctions prevented the oil revenues from flowing back to Iran, and there may be as much as $100 billion that could be released pretty quickly to Iran, maybe half of that from China. But when you think about even the IOCs, some of them also have money that they owe to Iran, and the Indians have money that they owe. So in some respects, when you think about sanctions lifting, some of the buyers of Iranian oil are a little bit worried that they're going to have to release this money pretty quickly once sanctions allow it. But in any case, the timing of Iran's oil and gas sector goals will depend on sanctions, the phasing out, the timeline, and the ability to export volumes. It's interesting because under the sanctions, Iran is still able to export oil to 6 countries: China, India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey. The EU stopped buying Iranian oil in 2012. As David mentioned, one of the interesting questions will be, at the time that these sales recommence, what will be the condition of the markets? There is right now so much excess production available. What happens with Libya? When does Iran come back in? Will markets that are going to be relied on by Iran, like China, because of the economic slowdown, will China need as much oil? And I think the key issue that's interesting when you look at the Chinese market is that some of those barrels that Iran hasn't been able to sell to China have been captured by the Saudis and the Russians. The Russians are major players in China now. Also in Europe, the Russians have captured some of those barrels that the Iranians haven't been able to sell. So the Saudis, the Russians, Nigerians, Kuwait, those countries that have benefited from Iranian oil to a large extent being taken off the markets are going to see some of their market share potentially decrease. But I think the interesting element for oil and gas companies that are watching Iran is that Iran has the world's 4th largest oil reserves. And it comes after Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. So it's actually a very big prize sitting at a very interesting intersection of accessing markets where it sits in the Persian Gulf. And there were quite a few companies that in the late 1990s and early 2000s had already been doing business with Iran. And I always, when I look at the current situation and the current officials that are back leading the charge in terms of attracting investment into Iran, whether it's Oil Minister Zanganeh or the Mehdi Hosseini who's negotiating the contracts, these are all individuals that had been dealing with the oil and gas companies back in the late 1990s and 2000s. And so there is an experience with certain companies that is already there. But at this point in time, the element that has benefited China is that their companies are actually still involved in the Iranian oil sector. And it's China's CNPC and Sinopec that are currently actually developing two of Iran's largest oil fields near the Iraqi border. And those fields are scheduled to be increasing production quite substantially over the next couple of years. So that's actually an element that will be interesting to watch how much more, I guess, the Chinese companies will capture. Offshore, South Pars, one of the world's major gas fields. Iran is the world's largest gas reserve holder, according to the latest BP statistical reviews. So I think the South Pars field, which will be developed in 24 phases, what's interesting about that is that the Iranians have already developed 11 of those phases. And even without sanctions removal, I think they will be looking to complete as many as 15 of those phases by the end of next year. So they have moved forward on South Pars, but where Iran is hampered in a way is that their domestic market is very strong for gas. So they have needed the gas both to supply the domestic market, and they re-inject a very sizable amount into their aging oil fields. However, before the sanctions came on, Iran had been planning 3 big LNG projects, and they will be looking to rev those up. I think the idea of putting an FLNG project offshore has already been raised to develop, to actually start developing for shipping overseas from one of the South Pars phases. But again, the question is, what market will this LNG come into? It will take a few years to get these projects, or 1 or 2 projects, off the ground. But the LNG business has changed dramatically over the last few years. And so, again, it's, what the market will be, where will this LNG go? I think as far as Iran looks at it, they're sitting in a prime position, given where they are in the Gulf, to actually maybe even ship LNG to Europe instead of thinking about pipeline gas. When it comes to the region, Iran also, I believe, is well poised to potentially supply some of their neighbors. But of course, there, the question is Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, they all need gas, but the politics of it will make it difficult. The only neighbor where Iran already has potential is really Oman. And I think the cooperation with Oman on an LNG pipeline, on a gas pipeline, is likely. But where Iran runs into some problems is disagreements over price. And the pricing issues have delayed, I believe, a pipeline even between Iran and Iraq. Certainly, it's been an issue in shipments across into Turkey. So, the pricing, both for oil and gas, I think will be a challenge for Iran once sanctions are lifted, and then how they work within the markets. So those were my comments, and hopefully we'll get to a question and answer session where we can address these topics more fully. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. That's very, very helpful. So on to Jean-Francois Seznec, who will give us the other side of the Gulf.
Well, thank you very much, and it's always great to hear from Julia. She knows so much. It's great, very interesting, really. I think what I'd like to do is maybe stick more to the economics of this rather than the politics so much, because Julia mentioned that Iran has the 4th largest oil reserve, but you also mentioned they have the 1st gas reserve. And for the life of me, I'm not sure there's great interest from Iran to really get involved in going back into the oil fields. The cost, they require so much technology and investments that they will be dependent on the IOCs substantially. If they are dependent on the IOCs, it means that whatever they get out of the $60 a barrel of oil will be fairly small. So I'm not sure they will put much emphasis on that. If they'll do what they can for as little money as possible, but I think their emphasis will be on natural gas. And why natural gas? Because as Julia mentioned, there is a great need in Iran for natural gas, but also in the Gulf. And I think the Gulf could very well become a major partner with Iran on natural gas. The Saudis do have presently enough natural gas for their own development, but whatever they're doing now is very expensive. And it would make a lot more sense for them to buy gas from Iran. The same for the UAE, the same for Oman, of course, and Kuwait, definitely. So I think the Iranians will most likely put much more emphasis on natural gas. The pipelines would make much more sense to me anyway than the LNG. But LNG is very good for the foreign companies who sell the equipment. But the cost of making the LNG is so high that I'm not sure it's really worth the effort. The pipelines would be a much better investment, but that doesn't seem to be a very popular view these days. So nevertheless, the Iranians will need to, will probably push the downstream from gas for their local stuff, using their ethane to create a much bigger, they already have a large ethane-based industry, but they could develop it much more. And they could deal with the Saudis in particular in selling them more natural gas and ethane, which the Saudis are not totally short of, but have, but at a certain expense. The question really that we discussed, and we discussed this with David many times, is what could be the answer of the Saudis to having the Iranians coming back to the market with many millions or a few million barrels per day. And I think, one, there has been this effort, as you mentioned, David, of the Saudis working with the Russians. I've argued elsewhere that the Saudis and the Russians are negotiating to cut production. Whether or not the price on that is acceptable, or whether the risk is acceptable by the Russians, the loss of face if they cut production might be too much to accept. But I think it would make a lot of sense for the Russians and the Saudis to work together, cut production by, say, 1 million barrels a day. That would take a lot of the problems afloat out of the market. That would also increase prices maybe to $80 a barrel, which is my own guess, not exactly mathematically precise. You can quote me, but say that I'm probably wrong. But nevertheless, I think it is not an accident that the deputy crown prince met with Putin and all the groups in Russia. There is a lot of agreement between the Saudis and the Russians to sort of work together on a number of issues. So I think we will see that more and more. But I think in the short term, slightly medium term, a little beyond short term, I think the Saudis have another vision of what they want to do. And I'm not talking about the royal family. We always talk about the royal family as if it was, the end all for Saudi Arabia. The civil service in Saudi Arabia for years and years and years and years is trying to express the thought that they should not become so dependent on the production of crude oil. Their view is to take their energy and add value to it. And that's exactly what they're doing right now. They have built up a capacity today of 3.3 million barrels a day for the refined products. Only 2.2 is actually producing right now, but they will be producing 3.3 probably by the end of this year. The products are then being exported in great part. Some of it is used locally. They are now importing gasoline anyway, so they will now be exporting more gasoline and so on. They will also continue their enormous development in chemicals, and not just basic petrochemicals, but advanced chemicals. SABIC is today the second largest chemical company in the world. Saudi Aramco is starting up, as we speak, they're starting up the Dow Chemical project, the Sadara project in Saudi Arabia, which is a $20 billion investment. They are already on a $20 billion investment with Sumitomo, and this will increase production, increase value-added productions a lot. And these productions are meant to go further downstream to the local companies. The name of the game here is for them to hire more Saudis, really. That's really their main issue. So I think the Saudis will probably emphasize more and more this downstream. I think the vision is to really get out of the crude oil production and to let people like Iraq and Iran be dependent on the world market and be basically third world countries. Because that's what third world countries do, is produce raw materials, except for South Dakota, of course. But I think the vision we're going to see, and it's moving very rapidly. Just a little factoid is that in December 2014, there's a Saudi chemical companies traded on the stock exchange in Riyadh were selling $86 billion worth of products. And, you know, that's pretty much the income of Saudi Arabia from oil in 2004. And I think those figures means that they're really moving forward. 2015, we'll see more of that, maybe a little less because the price of chemicals is going down, but that's another issue. Nevertheless, I think we will see more and more of that. So ultimately, I think the Saudis will be negotiating with the Iranians to sort of absorb the Iranians back into the business. There's also a market and a link between the two that could happen. And that's the link on natural gas that I mentioned. The Saudis have some technology. They have money. They could help the Iranians redevelop their gas field without being too dependent on the international companies. So I think seeing a glass half full in this case, I think it's really half full, not half empty. So I think we will see that moving forward quite a bit. That the Saudis also are pushing the development of their refining capacities overseas. So Motiva, which is the largest refinery in the world, based in Louisiana, and basically it's in Louisiana, I think. Yes, they have a capacity of 1.2 million barrels a day, and that's a joint venture with Shell. They have a huge refinery in Fujian in China, which is in joint venture with Sinopec and Exxon. They have one in Korea, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, the Saudis are protecting their crude production between their own refineries and the refineries overseas to about 5 million barrels a day, right there. Then they'll need probably a couple million barrels for their chemicals and so on. So they're at 7 million, and they're now producing 10. So I think ultimately, the Saudi contribution to the to the crude markets will decline, and I think that's where they know it's going to decline, and that's why I think they're not too worried about the Iranians coming back to the market. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you very much, Jean-François. And over to David Goldwyn for perspective on Iraq and more broadly.
And you can always count on Jean-François for some optimism. It's good, because otherwise the conversation can be a little bit dire. Great. Well, thank you, Jan, and great to be on with David and Julia and Jean-François. I'm going to talk about Iraq. I really want to make 4 points. One is that this war with ISIS is increasing the fragmentation of Iraq rather than drawing the country together, and I think that's a trend that's going to continue. The second is that one of the clearest symptoms of this is the unraveling of the KRG Baghdad deal, although it's more complex, I think, than what you read in the press. The third is that this low oil price cycle has created enormous fiscal pressure inside Iraq, which is both aggravating the fragmentation, but also delaying the ability of Iraq to increase its production and exports beyond the historically high levels, I guess, that it's at right now. And the fourth, and this is my contribution to the Jean-François optimism, is that this conflict within OPEC about how you will make room for Iraq will be significantly delayed, because you won't be seeing Iraqi production increase far beyond where it is right now. So that, I think that opens the floor for some deals. So first on fragmentation, really the point that David made with respect to the whole region. Ironically, there has been great success in the war on ISIS inside Iraq. They've been pushed out of Diyala and Nineveh in the Kurdish region, but that's because of the success of the Kurdish forces. And now the KRG has an arms relationship with the United States. They have success on the ground. They're not particularly welcome in the Sunni areas, even if they're driving out ISIS. But this has, I think, reinforced Kurdish autonomy and the Kurdish, at least, rhetorical claims for independence. But so I think that's one factor. In the South, you've seen these popular mobilization units, the Shia units, which are, collecting rents, I would say, is a nice way of putting it, both from the companies that are operating there and from the citizens, to protect them against a potential ISIS threat. But that's more self-protective. And then the complexity in the Sunni areas in Iraq, as it is in Syria, is that there's not a great deal of love for the current regime in those Sunni areas, not a great deal of willingness to fight for the country, and the Kurdish or Shia forces inside those Sunni areas are not particularly welcome. They're welcome to drive ISIS out, but not to stay. So this is leading to this fragmentation, and I think there's at least a narrative that we may move from what the U.S. once pushed, which was asymmetrical federalism for Iraq to encourage more autonomy for the Kurdish region, to symmetrical federalism for Iraq, where you might have three essential Emirati states. And the question then is, how much money is there for the other areas, and does this increase tension or not? The second point I wanted to make is this unraveling of the KRG-Baghdad deal. I think the one narrative of this is that Baghdad has not paid the Kurdish region what it's owed, and therefore they're walking away from the deal, and they will export on their own, and they will raise bonds on their own, and they will be self-sufficient. The other part of this story is that the deal was that the KRG would produce 550,000 barrels a day. That money would go back to the Baghdad government, and that would compensate for the 17% that they continue to collect. But they're not producing 550,000 barrels a day. So Baghdad's perspective is the KRG is a net winner in this deal, but not living up to it. But it's the politics that are really driving the unraveling, I think, and the opportunism, I think, from the KRG government to push for more autonomy. But it is a sign of this disintegration, a sign of this fragmentation inside the country, and it aggravates the third problem I want to talk about, which is the future of Iraq's oil production. So there has been some worries or some hopes, depending on which side you're on, that Iraq might increase its oil production 1 million barrels a day by completing the revamp of the Al-Faw Peninsula. But that's an $8 to $10 billion project, and the Iraqis pay their share either in oil or in cash, of which they have not much of either in excess. So there isn't a lot of revenue flowing in. It's hard for Baghdad to pay the companies which are currently operating there, and so they're in no position to make that kind of investment, nor can they really afford to spend more in cost oil, because that revenue is what drives the government. So it's hard to see any scenario in which that investment takes place, and so that kicks that. I think that kicks that revamp out a number of years. And that creates an interesting opportunity within OPEC, because my own view, and Jean-Francois and I have had this conversation sometimes, is that I think there are two things really driving Saudi behavior. I think the first is actually security, and that's both fear of Iran and fear of its weak neighbors and the fragmentation that it faces, and trying to weaken its adversaries and strengthen itself. And the war in Yemen is really to create a border space, if it can, not very successfully. But the second is the fear of its real competition, which is not Russia or the United States, but is the future of Iran and Iraq. But if Iraq is not going to grow its production significantly, and if Iran is going to go 500,000 to 800,000 barrels a day, but not much beyond that and not much quickly, then this situation may indeed resolve itself. And there won't be a need for a quota renegotiation or a negotiation within Iraq. And there is space, I think, as Jean-Francois has said, for a rapprochement on the economics. But my own view is that the rapprochement will have to be on security before it's on economics. And this is really the deal that's to be had. And so if there is less support by Iran for forces in Yemen so that there is a space, that will be good for Saudi. If you have Hezbollah and other forces out of Iraq, that will be good for Iran. So there's a little bit of a, I wouldn't say a peace, but a détente, a withdraw to your own area of interest. And that is a security deal that can be had between Saudi and Iran that would provide Saudi the security that it needs. But it's complicated. The Saudis will have to, in whatever relationship they have with the Wahhabi factions, reduce the flow of funds both to al-Qaeda and to IS in those regions, and demonstrate that successfully. That's not an easy move inside the kingdom. But if they can deliver their side and the Iranians can deliver their, then I think there is an economic deal to be had. But without progress on security, I don't think anything happens. And this will be a race to the bottom in which the Saudis are much better financed and able to compete than anyone in the Northern Gulf.
Well, thank you very much. It's a splendid set of presentations and a lot to think about. And before we turn to questions from the audience, perhaps we could talk a little bit more about the impact of a deal, a nuclear deal with the Iranians, or no nuclear deal on your analysis. And if you could just turn to that in terms of what you think that means for each of your areas, that would be, I think, very interesting for the audience to hear.
Well, let me say that I actually don't believe that a nuclear deal will bring on a momentum towards resolution of regional tensions. That I think that Julia's point that a nuclear deal will have attached to it a pretty big income to Iran relatively quickly is likely to reinforce the view that Iran is now able to establish itself as the dominant force in the region, and I suspect that will be the outcome. So, ironically, I don't think that this sort of goal that you sometimes hear from the administration of an Iran nuclear deal being the first step to this larger resolution, I'm a big skeptic on that. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think if there's no deal, then Iran moves along the way it's been moving. As I mentioned on the gas side, they're able to develop the South Pars field. They have acquired enough expertise within their domestic companies, but it's going to be a question of what they do with the gas in terms of exports. And I don't see the pipelines regionally moving forward quickly. Even with Oman, they don't seem to be able to agree on a price yet, or with Iraq. On the oil side, I think without sanctions relief, it's going to be the same countries continuing to buy what they buy. In this market right now, it's not clear to me that these same countries are going to need a great deal more. And furthermore, as I mentioned, even with sanctions relief, the question will be what happens in China and the Chinese market. Any more economic downturns in China, how much will they need in terms of extra oil from Iran? So even the future, given the condition of both the oil and gas markets, it's rather difficult right now to see. We don't know, of course, what will happen later in 2016 or in 2017. But anyway, for Iran, without sanctions relief, I guess they don't get that big chunk of money that's sitting there waiting to be returned.
I'm not sure I totally agree with David, more with the other David. I think the Saudis in particular and the UAE are very much expecting a settlement between Iran and the P5+1, but they will not move until this arrangement happens, if there is an arrangement, which we don't know yet. But if there is an arrangement, it is a sort of a cover for the Saudi leadership to sell to their more extreme factions the fact that, well, okay, we can still deal with the Shia because they are not going to have nuclear arms, because the US and the P5+1, not just the US, the P5+1 is guaranteeing that it's not going to happen. If those factions can be satisfied, then the Saudis can move into direct negotiations with the Iranians, and I think we will see these economic issues come to the fore. But I agree with David that there will be no negotiation unless that the Saudis feel comfortable that the security is taken care of. Absolutely. So that, but I think if they do, then we might see some very quick move, especially on the gas side of things. I think it's a lot better for the Saudis and the Iranians to work together on these matters.
I have to say, I think that the calculus is sort of overwhelming on the Iranian side for a deal, because Iran has a real economy. So even if oil moves slowly, the investment in consumer goods in the rest of the economy will be significant. So they will come out of this deal with only the nuclear portfolio constrained, not their conventional weapons. They will be in a stronger position economically, and they'll be in a stronger position strategically. So, and absent that, Saudis will take their share because they will be relatively capped, or they will have less production if we're able to ratchet back the relief that they've gotten so far. And so I think it's overwhelming on their side. For the Saudis, I mean, I don't know. There's enormous potential for miscalculation, but I don't see how they stand pat. Because if they stand pat and Iran outcompetes them, then they have nowhere to go but down. Now, they have enormous ability to sustain low prices for years, but it's not really a long-term sustainable strategy. I mean, how long do you drain those enormous reserves until you start affecting pension funds and everything else? So I don't think, while they can last longer, it would be quite a Pyrrhic victory for them to do this for 3 or 4 or 5 years. So I think the calculus is there, but they have very young leadership, which has demonstrated potential for miscalculation in its very short life so far. So I'm not predicting that they will, but I think rationality would suggest that they should.
Did you want to make another comment?
I mean, I do think that there is an economic rationale for the kind of deal that you're talking about. I really remain concerned here about the influence of the IGRC and the Quds Force, who I think really are bent on a regional domination strategy. And in the face of that, the Saudis are not going to do these deals. Not going to do these deals. So I think a prerequisite for the deals moving forward are a change in Iranian behavior. I think that's why the Saudis are engaging the Russians, because they believe, I'm not sure correctly, that the Russians have influence on Iran and can buy them that. We'll see.
I see.
Jean-François.
Well, I think that's a very good point. Definitely, the Saudis are talking to the Russian in great part. I mean, it's got to be. The timing is there. I think what's interesting is you're pointing out the division within Iran, and the same division really exists everywhere, in Saudi Arabia in particular, where you have some groups are much more opposed to the Iranians just because they're Shia. I mean, that's as stupid as that. But on the other hand, you have a very large number of people who don't care. And it's a question of who's going to win this battle. I mean, we have the same divisions in this country, so it's very hard to know which faction wins at any time. And it's very hard to make a calculation on this. I think that's why personally I put so much emphasis on the P5+1 agreement, which ultimately may not resolve anything, but ultimately it will give the more positive factions the ability to win the day in each one of these countries and have rationality come through. I think one of the key issues is that the Saudis probably are very well aware that they have no chance of winning against ISIS by themselves, and that it will not happen unless there is an arrangement with Iran. And why are they fighting in Yemen? They're fighting in Yemen, they're bombing Yemen and so on to force some kind of a negotiation in Yemen, but mostly to show the Iranians that they do have some military power. Okay, maybe it's not as good as we'd like, but they have some power, and therefore they must be negotiated with and not just laughed at. So I think we have a potential for negotiation should the very fundamental issue of nuclear is taken care of.
Yep.
Yes, David.
Well, you just wonder what that Iran strategy looks like. That's basically hotter wars on most of their borders. We've got the U.S. arming sort of the Sunni forces, the Russians probably arming both sides, so they can do something for the Saudis and for the Iranians too.
And make some money.
And so that works for the Russians. How well does it work for the Iranians to be engaged in that? And it might drive oil prices up, but not in a good way. Yeah. And the risk, I think, to stability in Saudi Arabia from aggravating those forces is, graver than sometimes we give it credit.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, and I think it's a good time to turn to the audience. And would you please identify yourself before you ask the question? Right in front.
Thank you. Stephen Landy, Manchester Trade. I spent my life in trade negotiations, so I don't know if I can relate it to these negotiations, which seem like a trade negotiation. My own prediction is that by dessert at the lunch at the Wilson Center, or certainly by dessert tonight, there will be an agreement. I don't know what the timing is with the Senate and this 30 and 60 days and how specific the agreement has to be, but that's my own personal feeling. I have two questions. One was just partially answered by John Francois, and that was, what about Yemen? I mean, this is a possible situation. You said a little bit about it, and like a little bit more as to whether or not. I was told that the Iranians have not been that active with the Houthis, could have been much more active, and is worth noting, and so on. The second thing I don't understand as a trade negotiator is this 10 years. In 10 years, half of us are going to be dead, Alzheimer's or what, of the older generation and so on. You do a trade agreement, you always say, okay, 10 years from now we'll return to this issue and so on. There obviously are going to be so many changes in 10 years and so on. I understand a little bit of the other issues, but this 10-year issue I just can't relate to. And I think what might happen, and let me just make it a last question then real quick, is that Obama may calculate that the Republicans are going to lose this debate over Iran, particularly if it goes over the summer during the recess, because in point of fact, there's no alternative for the U.S. than signing, because they don't really have an ability to stop the development without signing. I would love your views on that as well, whether or not a continuation of the debate may actually be more favorable to Obama than a quicker signature. Thank you very much.
All right, who would like to tackle that? Jean-Francois, are you interested in?
Oh, well,
leading the
I
charge?
think Yemen we covered. I think whether or not the Iranians are involved in Yemen, the Saudis think they're involved in Yemen, and perception maybe 90% of the fact. Probably there is some influence, whether the Iranians have the means to actually do a big support of the Houthis. The Houthis seem to be doing pretty well by themselves, so I'm not sure. But I think the key there is for, as I mentioned earlier, is for the Saudis to make a point that they exist as a military power, which some people across the water here who have been training them for 50 years were highly questioning. So we'll see how that develops. I cannot comment on the other issue. Maybe Julia, I don't know.
Yeah,
So I mean, I think in terms of an agreement, the key for an agreement under Corker-Cardin is just to avoid having more than a handful of Democrats defect, and I actually think the president's in quite good shape. I think there's going to be a lot of Sturm und Drang around this, but I think the president's in quite good shape on it. So I think there's more of a political challenge going forward on the Tehran side, and it was very interesting yesterday, because I think yesterday you got a sense in some of these public comments of a difference in view from the White House and from the negotiating team. So Josh Earnest gets on and says, no deadlines, no firm deadlines, actually a pretty good idea. The team in Tehran says, we want to get this done because the risk really rises if our counterparts have to go back to Tehran. And that's really the essence of the debate now. I think Obama politically gains from shooting through this deadline. I would bet I'll buy you a drink on this if you'll buy me one the other way. I don't think we get an agreement today. But I do think we're going to get an agreement, but it's going to take a little while longer.
And the 10 years?
10 years.
No, I mean the 10 years.
10-year question, right.
The 10-year question had to do, and I just don't know if this works, but I think the expectation in the U.S. government was that things in Iran change over 10 years. Either the regime changes its character internally or it gets replaced. And I think that's the expectation, is that you're buying something that isn't just temporary, but that the political expectation, and you know, as one who I had to do a lot of work on North Korea in an earlier part of my career, you could have blown me over with a feather 20 years ago if you told me that the North Korean regime was going to be around in 2015.
I don't disagree. I think 10 years. I think we also think maybe our counter-proliferation capabilities might increase over that period, so we'll be able to handle it. But it's also what they could get. But I think on the, I don't know that the longer we wait, the better off we are. I think that was the calculation that was going on, is the Iranians wondered whether we were more afraid of our Congress than they were, and whether when our calculation was, did they really believe that they ought to be afraid of letting our Congress have more time to look at it? And I think neither side really bought it. So I think the negotiations will go on longer, since we'll probably be stuck with that 60-day review period either way. And so the Iranians thought we'd buckle, and we didn't. And that was, I think, a lot of what was going on. So in that sense, Obama's hand is strengthened. But I don't see, whatever the deal is, the Congress being able to override a veto. So I think the president is in good shape, and this is about getting the best deal he can.
Yes, a question I saw in the back. Is there? Yes, all the way in the back. And again, identify yourself. And let me just remind the audience, even though we want to talk about the nuclear deal, this is a focus on the energy situation in the Middle East. So if you could at least tie in the nuclear deal to that, I'd appreciate it. I don't know whether I derailed the question or not by saying that.
My name is Scott Trevig from Edison Electric Institute. If a deal is made, what will be the impact on the prices of LNG and oil, with Iran now joining the party, and a more abundance of both sides coming in to the market? What will be the effect on prices both in the Middle East, Europe, and abroad?
I have to say, we had this conversation about LNG. I don't really see the Iranians becoming an LNG power in the next decade, if for no other reason that we still control the technology, and I don't think those export controls are coming off anytime soon. And it's pretty slow. So I think they get pushed out. Plus, it's a really lousy market to finance these deals in. Pipelines are another matter, where I think they're pretty close and they have infrastructure, and then it's a question of more competition for the European market, and maybe competition, who knows, for the Indian market as well. So I think, net more supply, whether it goes by pipe or LNG, you're talking softening a market that's already soft till 2020. Post 2020, I think you're looking at so many uncertainties. I mean, does Mozambique really happen? Does Tanzania happen? Do the Australia projects really close? Are there any more expansions in the U.S. post-COP? Do people really move to more gas, as backup for renewables? And then does demand pick up? So it could be that a lot of the projects you're counting on post-2020 don't happen, and then that market belongs to whoever is quickest to market, in which case the Iranians might do pretty well because they can move more quickly, and we should do pretty well because we can move more quickly, but maybe those longer projects, the more expensive ones, don't. So.
And on oil, I guess the way prices are headed now, which is below $60 a barrel, it's hard to see what will happen in late 2016 or mid-2016. That's about the time when maybe Iranian oil could come back on in any larger quantities. So, but it won't be that large. So there will be an oil price impact, clearly, but it's hard to say exactly. Is it $5, $10, $15? There's a lot of numbers being thrown out right now in the media, but it's hard to know.
Yeah, I think the key issue will be the gas market, not so much the oil market. That I totally agree with. And I also agree with David that the chances of LNG happening in Iran is minimal. And it's actually not good for Iran to do LNG because it's going to end up costing them a fortune. So I think they will continue developing. The pipes can be linked to Uzbekistan, which then ends up in China. I mean, that's going to be a big plus. They can go to Turkey. There already is some links. So I think we will see a lot more of that, and I think gas will be the key issue there.
Yes, the lady in.
Hi, I'm Maria Hardman with the National Iranian American Council. I had a question. There seemed to be a fairly optimistic consensus among panel members that Iran might be able to engage with the Gulf states on energy negotiations I promise I'm not going to talk about the deal, that they might be able to engage with the Gulf states on energy negotiations. I was wondering if you might elaborate on that a little bit more and whether or not political considerations would trump those energy negotiations, and how soon realistically would you be able to see those sorts of negotiations taking place?
So I don't think there was a consensus on this. So I'm skeptical that that's going to happen, because I'm a bit skeptical that Iran is going to ease up in its regional policy, and that equally likely, at least as likely, is that they're going to be emboldened by the fact that they're in a financially much stronger place. So I'm a bit of a skeptic here on that, although, I mean, and here's the interesting piece, is that the IS piece, I think, has at least the possibility of drawing them together, because I think that you're right, Jean-Francois, that the Saudis realize that they can't do this alone, and the Iranians are extraordinarily concerned about this. So this may be, and that's why this Russian proposal is so interesting now.
Yeah.
Comments from anybody else on the panel?
No, I think it's quite an interesting situation. I think there will be if there is an agreement between the P5+1, I think the Iranians and the Saudis will be able to work together to a certain extent. So I'm reasonably optimistic, but it's a big if. We still don't have, even though I think it's likely to happen, we still don't have it. But IS, the Islamic State, is a big danger for both. And I think the Saudis and the Iranians will work together to bring back a more stable environment in the region. So that will work also in the favor of the energy situation in some ways.
Well, one thing we can watch is if they ever settle the Dora gas field, because that's a shared field between Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iran. If they can reach an agreement on what to do with that, then maybe they can reach an agreement on how to handle their gas relations.
I wouldn't put much money on that.
Okay, then.
I just add that I think it gets a little worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
I think that definitely in the posturing and testing phase, you'll have, if the deal happens, and then you see whether the Iranians comply with the deal, and the Saudis may wait to see whether they get lucky and have the sanctions snap back on them without their having to do anything. I think you have these proxy wars continue, but I think IS really is the key. When the Saudis decide that IS is their number one enemy rather than Iran is their number one enemy, and that has a lot to do with Iranian behavior as well, then I think you have the opportunity for a deal. But I think IS is the real enemy. I think it is a serious threat.
And it gives a lot of opportunities to Russia to be sort of to play the various factions to its advantage.
I hate that.
Well, that's not so good. But anyway.
Well, the degree of optimism about Saudi-Iranian entente is really striking. I think that others might have a different view on that.
Well, it can happen. It has happened in the past. Before Ahmadinejad, there were some pretty constructive relations were happening. That's right. And then it disappeared.
Yes.
But it could come back. I think
that was in a time before the Iranians played.
Yeah.
Or even had the kind of regional aspirations.
But I don't want to be a cynic, but I think basically the interests of the countries matter more than the ideologies in this case. And I think the Iranians and the Saudis will fight each other as much as they can with someone else's money and someone else's people. When they can't do anything else, will have to get together.
Yes, several hands are up, and let me see. You've been waiting for a while. Get a mic over. Right.
Thank you. My name is Andreas Nicolaides, and I'm the DCM at the Embassy of Cyprus. First of all, I would like to thank you for very, very interesting presentations by all parties. And I have one question and one observation. I will tend to agree with Mr. Gordon with regard to the security aspects. And what we have been consistently hearing from Gulf countries when we talk about these issues and Iran is that, and they make this point consistently, is that the drivers of regional policy in Iran are very, very different from the people who negotiate the nuclear deal. So there's a huge level of mistrust between most Gulf states and Iran, with, of course, the notable exception of Oman. And my question is, with regard to Russia and how Russia will benefit or not from a nuclear deal with Iran. I can see many geopolitical reasons for Russia to want a nuclear deal with Iran. Also, there are economic interests in terms of arms procurement and nuclear development. But with regard to natural gas, as you said, the potential for Iranian section, I mean, wouldn't that be potentially a threat to Russia, the Russian monopoly on the European market? And it doesn't add up in the end. I think that they are economically, they have more to lose than to benefit. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you. That's a good question.
Can I address that? I think if you think about, so far, what are Iranian exports? They're really to Turkey, and it's a question of price. There's been so much disagreement over the price because Iran has wanted a far higher price. Now, when you look at the netback into the European market, I mean, I have seen comments from Iranians now thinking maybe LNG is a better option than going with a pipeline. It would be so long to take a pipeline from Iran across Turkey into Europe that, given that, and it would be way into the future. So, and I suppose you're looking at it from the point of view of competition also with Cyprus. But when it comes to Russia and Iran, where is it that they would compete? I mean, we're talking about potentially regional markets in the Gulf for Iran for its gas. Eventually, maybe many years down the line on LNG, but right now I don't see them as being really true competitors in Europe at all.
So I think right now the Iranians see the natural gas largely in regional terms. And I suspect, and I agree with Jean-Francois that there is this emphasis on natural gas as against oil. So I think that's where this potential economic cost may be perceived as mitigated. And on the other side, I mean, it's absolutely clear that the Russians see a huge increase in terms of armament sale.
Yes. On the you were waiting for a while. The person in front, right? You. Yes.
Well, just as an extension of that question.
Identify yourself, please.
My name is Peter, and I am from Senator Kirk's office, Mark Kirk's office. As an extension of that question, I guess, what would the effect of the kind of the energy boom here in the United States be on that natural gas kind of attempt to get a natural gas market by Iran?
Great question.
Well, look, I mean, again, maybe longer term there would be an impact, and certainly maybe it's hard to know where prices are headed right now. It's not looking very good even for Australian natural gas LNG export projects, which are very expensive. But I think the U.S. price issue, because the U.S. is able to price lower or at least at a very competitive level right now. I think for the Iranians, no matter what happens, as Jean-Francois and Dave Goldwyn has been mentioning, is that basically, it would cost so much at least to develop these LNG projects that selling into this market, the U.S. is so far ahead already that it's hard for me to see where that competition is going to matter, at least in the short term, maybe longer term. I don't know.
I think oil is different, though. I agree with you completely on gas. But on oil, Iran competes on condensate as well as on crudes. And there's no question that as they are a competitor in the market, it will be harder on U.S. producers because it's likely to increase that spread between domestic prices, international prices, and that gets to the export issue. Certainly, if you remove the export constraints and you had U.S. competition, we were able to move condensate to Asia and to other places, we would have an impact on Iranian revenues and on Iranian exports. And then crude, it kind of depends a little bit on the crude match, but we've heard from, as recently as yesterday from governments in Europe, the Dutch government and others, that they would like a future where they can depend more on American supply than on supply from the Middle East they see as less stable, or on Russia, which has its other costs. So I think that's the real difference. You keep that constraint in place, then you'll have more pain on oil and on condensate, less so on gas.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, to my mind, I think the national security arguments around lifting of export restraints are now probably stronger than what's happening in the markets themselves. Before the price shift, it was the markets that were driving this. But I think now the big arguments, I think, are national security arguments, and particularly the Iran argument, I think, is huge here.
Mm-hmm. We have time for 2 more questions, and I see 2. If you could make quick questions, and we'll have quick answers. Right.
Okay. My name is Roman Kilisek. I'm from Breaking Energy. I wanted to address the natural gas question in connection with Qatar. What happens with Qatar, given that you pointed out that Iran would look regionally? Qatar has tensions with GCC, other member states. Qatar always contemplated building a pipeline, I think it's Dolphin Pipeline, to the UAE. How does this shape the whole security and energy environment by factoring in Qatar?
Well, I think one of the issues for Qatar will be and in the past they have cooperated with Iran. I mean, they share a giant gas field together, largest in the world. So you could potentially see more cooperation with Iran on the development of the North Field, South Pars Field. It would make sense, but you're right that there is an issue with, these are 2 big behemoths in the Gulf, and they both, to some extent, have maybe regional aspirations.
The pipeline to the UAE already exists, and and it is being used. The problem they have between the UAE and Qatar to not expand it is because the UAE only pays $1.4 per million BTU, and the UAE have said in public, I've seen it, I've heard it from the minister in public, that they would be very happy to buy a lot more at that price, and the Qataris very publicly said no, thank you very much. So I think the pipeline you might be referring to was the one to Kuwait, which was a big issue in which the Saudis nixed totally, and that for reasons I'm not quite clear about, but that is not come back, and the Kuwaitis have built now a plant to regasify the LNG to buy from Qatar, which makes absolutely no sense from an economic standpoint. But I think the Qatar could continue to will suffer basically from the Iranian coming back to the market, definitely. But as I mentioned before, and I think David mentioned before, the Iranians are not about to produce LNG anytime soon, and the Qataris, that's all they do at this point, is produce LNG, except for what's exported to the UAE and Oman by pipeline. So I don't know where it's going to go, but I think Qatar is not making as much money as we think they are, basically. Their costs are high. Qatar by itself doesn't produce. It's produced by ExxonMobil and Maersk and people of this nature. So that has a huge cost. And today, with the cost of LNG to Japan having been cut almost by half, I would even argue that the Qataris today are making almost no money on their exports. So I'm not sure exactly where this is going to go, but it's making the Qataris much more dependent on agreeing with the Saudis on almost everything. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure I answered your question.
We have thank you. That's very good. Quick question, quick answer, if that's possible before
no problem. Hi, my name is Gabriel Uribe. I'm here with the delegation of the European Union here in DC. So my question is regarding is actually an extension to the question of the gentleman from the Cypriot embassy here. Obviously, one of the parties which has the biggest gain from this deal is the European Union, because it opens up the Iranian energy market to Europe, which is trying to diversify away from Russia. Now, we've seen that Russia has been very unwilling to let go of its dominance over the European market, first canceling South Stream, now establishing Turkish Stream, establishing a much more friendly relationship with Greece, Turkey, and now Saudi Arabia. I want to ask how you see the future of Russia's relationship with the Middle East in terms of energy markets there and influencing especially the future of the European energy security from what could potentially become a very significant future gas supplier to the European Union. Thank you.
There can be a 30-minute response or a 30-second response, but let's try to make it exactly shorter rather than longer. Yes. Anybody want to tackle that?
I don't see the Russians having a particular technological advantage in investing in Iran or the Middle East. So I don't see a big play for them there. And I think on the European security question, diversity of supply is good, but what the EU really needs to focus on is infrastructure and connections and allowing more diverse sources of LNG into the market. And so that agenda is internal, and that's going about as well as the relationship with Russia.
That's a good 30-second response.
And I totally agree with what David just mentioned, but there might be a little trick to this situation here. Is we oftentimes forget that this is a very inelastic commodity, so that if the Russians and the Saudis can come up with an agreement to cut 1 million barrels, the cut in income in the price of gas will be much less than the return on income, because the price will go up faster. So I think without the Russians investing, they can make more money if they play their cards right.
Any final comments from Julia and David?
Well, I think Russia will still have to be a significant supplier to the European market. The question is how it will get there. And existing infrastructure through Ukraine is probably the best way to send some of the Russian gas into Europe still. And for the Iranians, I think, as I said earlier, I think there's still quite a ways to go before they can do pipeline gas into Europe. And our discussion on LNG indicates that that could take some time as well. So for Iran to become a source of diversification for the European market, for its gas may take a while. On the other hand, I think European companies have a tremendous advantage in terms of coming in to invest in the upstream, both oil and gas in Iran.
I think there's an important a larger geopolitical story in terms of what Russia's doing in the Middle East. I think that Russia also sees itself threatened by IS in the Caucasus, in particular. But I also think that emerging as a positive part of the story in the Middle East, now that the Middle East crisis is come to Europe in the form of refugees, for Moscow will serve as a balancer to hostility from Europe on the Ukraine issue. And I think that's really shaping a lot of how they're thinking about this.
Interesting. Well, let's thank the panel for a very far-ranging and interesting presentation.